One of the things I'm curious about is, from your perspective, is like the early culture of the Oregon winemakers here. What was that like?
Do you mean by that, what was it like when we got together as a group and talked, or I'm not...
Two different points of view. One is, when you got together, what was it like when you were, meeting at the firehouse, or you're, meeting? And then the second is, I'm also kind of curious, is like how you were accepted by the public, by the farmers that you're surrounded with.
Okay, yeah, that's
So
two very different questions,
right.
yeah. Okay, so certainly the first half of that, the kind of what was the culture within the industry, and the culture was, even before meeting in the fire station in Taggart, it was meeting in Bill Blosser's living room, or Dick Erath's living room, or Chuck Corey's living room, and it was really about a very small group of people doing something that was very much an adventure, a long shot, so outside the norm of what would be expected or considered possible. We were all on the same team together because it was so out there. And of course, this is
growing grapes in Oregon was so out
yeah,
there.
yeah. And this is the early 70s, at a time when a lot of people in the country were pursuing out there things, or things that they didn't know very much about, and were trying to expand their own horizons. And so it certainly fit in. If you looked at it, if you could have pulled back far enough, it would have fit in with what was going on, not just in wine, but in all aspects of society among people in their 20s and 30s. But we couldn't have seen that. We wouldn't have been able to pull back that far and see what was going on. It's only in retrospect that we can see it. And at the time, we felt we were on our own, that there weren't a lot of resources for us. We could talk to the people in planning agencies, like in Yamhill County. We could talk to certain aspects of Department of Agriculture at the State Department of Agriculture, and certainly some of the people at Oregon State University. But fundamentally, we were on our own and relying on each other for information. And there was a pretty broad willingness to share whatever one knew with the rest of the group.
Now, where did that sharing ethos come from? Because
Well, I think it's
your competitors.
Yeah, but we weren't. Because that's the whole point of this, is that we weren't competitors. We were all in this together, creating something out of thin air. And even the first people, David Lett, then Chuck Corey, then Dick Erath, and Dick Ponzi, all were willing to share what they knew, because it wasn't about competition. It was about building enough of a substance that we could be a speck of dust on the head of the pin. I don't know. My guess is that a lot of wine industries are much more sharing than sort of the general world of business, in part because ultimately it goes back to the grapes. If you're doing the greatest job in the winery, and you're really doing a great job in the vineyard, and obviously doing a great job selling wine, still the quality of what you make is to some extent dependent on the place where your grapes are planted. The thing,
Very local place, like
yeah,
Sloan,
your own vineyard, their own vineyard site. To some extent, it's also, in retrospect, dependent on the passion, attention to detail, and strive for excellence that you bring to the project, but we didn't know that then. We and maybe we did, but that wasn't what this was about, because we were so far down the list of things that needed to be done in the beginning, that everything that we could learn from each other made a major improvement in what we were doing. That's the first aspect of culture that you talked about.
You know, it's interesting. You said that in like the attention to detail, it didn't seem to be very high priority. You were just getting basic
Yep.
kinds of things.
Yep.
Down. Like what kind of things?
Well, I'm how far apart should your rows be? How far apart should your plants be? Where do you get your vines? What kind of a tractor can you find? What kind of bean poles can you buy? And who's got bean poles for 2 cents? Use bean poles that you can use for your trellis system. I mean, it was really basic stuff. But walking before running, or crawling before walking, or whichever. And to some extent, it was the kind of people who were attracted to this challenge early on, those that I mentioned and others, that perhaps had enough of the strive for excellence and attention to detail and all that, that the distance between 1966 and 1978, 79, 80, when David Lett started getting recognition, and into the mid-80s when the rest of us started getting a little recognition and beyond, was as short a time as it was. Because I think the people had that attention to detail and passion for excellence and creativity and just willingness to do it to move us that quickly. And obviously Oregon was the right place for Pinot Noir. We all believed it at the time, but when we were investing our lives in it, I don't know that anybody knew that that was absolutely the truth. They sure hoped it, though, and whether the sums of money bet were great or not, they certainly bet their lives on it.
It seems like that early group of people were kind of pretty special people. It's like there was some kind of motive there to take a big chance, and then I think everyone came from a fairly highly educated background. Yeah, I think that's true. I think, but you know, it's a microcosm of what was going on in the country at the time. There were
Which was
this creative energy being put into new places. I mean, you go around the country and there are wineries in almost every state, and most of their wine industries, or the rapid expansion of them, date back to the late 60s and early 70s. Even arguably much of California dates to that period, even though there's obviously a history before that, even obviously in Ohio and other places that used to be important. But I think if you look across the world of cultural endeavor in America, and maybe beyond, but I'm not going to go there, an awful lot is due to the generation that came of age in the late 60s and early 70s and put their effort into new areas that they had not necessarily been educated to deal with. They came out of an education from the 50s and 60s, which was kind of the same direction as what had existed in America for 30 or 40 years, and then plunged it on, or turned it on its head, and went into fields that they had no education for. A few were educated in it. I mean, David Lett and Chuck Corey had gone to Davis in one sense or another, and others had taken some classes, not very much though. But by and large, the industry was made by people who didn't have technical education in growing grapes or making wine, but were willing to embark on it and do it in a way that they believed would result in the highest quality. Nobody did this because they felt that this would be a great way to earn money.
So it wasn't to start a business. It was.
I don't remember anybody talking about starting a business. Every now and then somebody probably mentioned something along that line, but I think that it really wasn't about that.
Yeah.
It was starting an industry. It was starting a way of life. It was starting, to use Marvin Schenken's word, a lifestyle. It really, it was all encompassing. It was, if you did anything else, it was because you needed money to be able to do this.
How's the wine culture today different, the same as when you started?
I think there are lots of elements of that culture left.
Like?
Oh, I mean, you look at the new people, particularly those that don't come with large amounts of money, but come with passion and excitement and desire to learn about wine and about Oregon wine, and who recognize that they get to stand on the shoulders of the people that came before them, but nonetheless are willing to get dirty and jump in and really make a contribution to the industry. I mean, there's a whole array of those kinds of people who aren't having to invent an industry, but are having to apply an even greater level of perfection and attention to and continue to keep a level of passion and excitement about what they're doing that would allow them to make the kinds of wines that give them a place in the world, in our industry. It's much tougher today to make that place for yourself than it was then.
Because the bar is raised higher.
Because the bar is so high. And particularly, nobody's going to get into the business of making Pinot in the North Willamette Valley and have as their goal to make $15 Pinot Noir. Because the statement of excellence is somewhere between $40 and $60 or whatever the number is. And so to be able to create a wine at that level is incredibly difficult. But they offer their services to other wineries. They learn by doing. They get together with other people, particularly other, let's say, young people that are in the same shoes as they are. And I think that there's a certain amount of being part of something that's bigger than just they are. That they're wanting to do this, again, not because they want to make money or because they want to start a business, but because they want to participate in the creation of both wine and the culture around wine and the industry that is wine in Oregon.
So it's almost like that motive that you're talking about there is somewhat parallel, not similar, but parallel to like the motive that you had.
No, it's the same.
It's the same.
Yeah, it's not parallel. It's the same motive. No, very much. I mean, there's certainly plenty of aspects that are separated and maybe parallel or whatever. But no, I mean, the things that drive a young person to work harvest with us or with any of the wineries that are established in order to get enough experience to be able to know that they're not going to make mistakes when they go out and spend what little money they have to either start planting vineyards or buying grapes and making their first wines. No, it's very much the same thing. They're not doing it because this is the fast way to make a buck. There may be a certain amount of ego involved, but even back then there was probably some ego. It just seemed awfully far away before we'd get any recognition. And today, recognition can come sooner. Certainly you can, if you can impress the right wine critic with even your first or second effort, you can suddenly become reasonably important in American wine world. And that certainly was not something that we thought was remotely possible, even if there had been the magazines and the critics available to us at the time.
But I was just thinking, it's like early on, you weren't even sure that, like the grapes would grow here.
Right.
Whether you'd be successful at doing that. I mean,
Right.
that's really throwing the seed to the wind. And
Yeah.
now it's like that's a given.
Yes, that part is that's surely different. Yeah.
When you look to the future now, like say 30, 40 years down the line, and this question comes from, like in France, like the wine industry's, been around for centuries upon centuries. Will the Oregon wine industry still be here in 50 years?
Yeah, I think you asked me this before, and I think I said yes.
What will it look like?
I think it will look like much of the wine industry in the United States looks, which is a certain number of relatively large enterprises that are businesses and that principally feed the world of distribution. Hopefully there'll be some middle tier wineries that also feed distribution, but at a higher price point and a higher level of expectation. And then there'll be large numbers of small enterprises that sell their wine directly to consumers. And it's hard for me to believe that model will change. Now, maybe it will. I guess it's possible that wine would go out of favor, that it would be shown instead of to be healthy, that everybody who drinks a sip of Pinot Noir is actually putting a nail in their coffin. But it seems pretty unlikely for a beverage that's been around for 6,000 years or 7,000 years to suddenly become unhealthy or perceived as unhealthy, beyond, of course, the obvious unhealthy aspect of drinking too much of it. But it's certainly wine will come in and out of style. I mean, the real question you're asking is not, although you've asked it as what will the Oregon wine industry look like, the Oregon wine industry has quickly become part of the American wine industry. There are aspects, when you lift the covers, you can see some aspects that are slightly different and still have a tinge of the beginning and still make Oregon a unique place to grow wine and to grow grapes and make wine. But the overall look of the wine industry today is a reasonable part of the American wine industry.
Well, where my question actually comes from is like the American culture, just comparing to France.
Yep.
American culture is quite a bit different than the French culture.
Yep.
And then the Oregon culture is still a subset, a fairly unique subset in the American culture.
Right.
And so it seems like that has a tremendous amount of influence on Oregon. I think also about California. California, the history what we can say is a little bit old, longer than the history that we have here, and it's like become something pretty interesting in Napa. And so I'm wondering what's going to happen here. I mean, does it become like the Disneyland in Napa?
Well, that's really going to be up to the leaders of the industry and the leaders of the state, whether we can guide the growth of the industry in a way that it does not overtake certain aspects of the landscape. And we're quickly running out of time to do that. I mean, when you drive around certain parts of the Dundee Hills and Ribbon Ridge and Yamhill Carlton, and even on this road right here, there is so much development that has occurred and is about to occur, new plannings going in, that it's becoming a monoculture. And a monoculture is bad enough in terms of the environment, the natural environment, but on top of that, it becomes a monoculture culturally, from a human aspect. And if all that Ribbon Ridge can do, or that the Dundee Hills can do, or that Yamhill Carlton area can do, is grow grapes to the exclusion of all other things, then a lot of the beauty that draws people here now, and a lot of the reason that we love living here, will be gone. And so it's probably only a challenge in Yamhill County so far. It's where the concentration of growth is. Yesterday I was doing some driving in a couple of areas over the weekend, and there's so much new planting going in, and it's all right next to older plantings, because nobody is planting in some place that hasn't already shown itself to be successful. And so that's going to be the challenge of the next 10 years, is to get a handle on where this is going and to try to guide it in a direction that we'll be proud of in 10 years rather than sorry about.
And so that's where I'm wondering too. It's like the American culture is such a capitalistically motivated culture. Much is a broad generalization, more so than in France. So that I wonder about those kinds of influences here.
Yeah. If I had an answer, I'd tell it to you, but I think all we have is the question right now.
Yeah. Early on, we talked about, like, the second part of the culture is the farmers that are around you, the people that are buying your wines.
Well, the farmers that were around us at the beginning weren't buying our wines, that's for sure. Partly because we didn't have any wine, but also because they weren't likely to be drinking wine. I mean, the reality was that the North Willamette Valley, and particularly Yamhill County, was the focus of early development because there was land available. It seemed to David Lett and to others that followed to be a reasonable place to plant Pinot Noir and other cool climate grapes. But there was no history of it, a very modest history, where Chuck Corey was planted, but most other people planted in a place where there was really no history of grape growing. And there was certainly no wine culture in Oregon. There were people in Portland that drank wine, but at the very least it came from California or from France. There was really no wine. There was no wine culture within the state of Oregon about wine from Oregon, of course. And when I put the first wine list of Oregon wines together in 1976, I think it was. No, 75. when I worked at a restaurant in Portland, and I had, I think, wines from 4 or 5 different wineries. And wanting to be like a European restaurant in the sense of being proud of what was local, we put that section of the wine list first. A lot of people kind of were puzzled that there would be anything that they'd never heard of Oregon wine. And this was, 10 years after, well, not, probably 7 years after the first wines, and certainly there had been some stuff written, but typically it was a long, slow curve for people to learn about the local wines and the fact that it was something that was right outside their door if they lived in Portland, and they could even visit and see it happening and taste it and be part of it.
Yeah. But like wine wasn't a real cultural part of the culture.
No, and not in the U.S. either. I mean, really, even in California, when we first went to Napa, there's no fine dining. There was no place to buy wines. There were like 10 or 12 wineries in Napa Valley in the late '60s, and there was certainly nothing. There was nothing remotely like what there was in Europe, and even Europe. When I worked in France in '74, there was only very modest tourism in Beaune. I mean, Beaune is now a tourism city, but when I worked there, it was, there would be some tourists from Belgium and Switzerland coming over to pick up wine, but not really. Frankly, I mean, all of Western Europe and much of the United States has radically changed into a place that is much more excited about wine tourism. That doesn't mean that people who live in Burgundy go to Spain to visit wineries on their vacation. But what it does mean is that people in Paris go to vineyards, and people in Madrid go to vineyards to see the place and to experience the place that their wines come from. And people from Portland do the same.
So, what year did you sell your first bottle of wine? How much?
78.
78. How much did it cost?
First wine we sold was a Semillon from Washington that we made we would have sold it in '79, and it would have sold for, I'm thinking it was under $10. It was like $7.99, something like that.
Yeah. And who bought it?
A number of retailers bought it. A couple of restaurants bought it. There was no way to sell it direct to consumers, other than if you had your own event, and nobody would have come if you had an event in those days. Yeah. So really, all you had was to be able to take it out and offer to sell it to people. But partly because I'd worked in restaurants and knew some people and at least had an understanding of how wine was bought and sold, we could traipse it around to the various retailers and restaurants that might be interested and get them to buy it. Yeah. We were able to make that happen and be fairly successful at it.
When did tasting rooms become an important part of the business?
Well, clearly it's been a curve, not a point. Yeah. I'm not sure who had the first devoted tasting room. Seems like it was Sokol Blosser, but I could be wrong. Certainly, they must have been among the early ones to create a room that was clearly a place set aside to taste wine and buy wine.
Rather than a garage with a table.
Well, yeah, or something that was open part of the time. I mean, they had regular hours, they had a real building, they staffed it, etc. And you can get that from Susan or one of the family members when they did it. But I think they were probably the first that I know of. But when we were going to build our winery here, in the first part of it, 1972, we were talking to a number of people about whether we needed to consider a tasting room, and we were told no, There would be no way that anybody would ever find us here off the road. We're 5 miles from Newburgh, and there's just no point in doing it. It's just a barely break-even aspect to things right on 99, they said. And thus, we made no plans for a tasting room when we built this winery. And obviously, in our earlier winery, we had nothing because of the same reason. But over time, as we got toward the end of the 90s, we found more and more people finding us, seeking us out, knocking on our door, and we had a great public relations approach, which was to say, no, we're not open, go away, which made a lot of friends, I'm sure. But luckily, we've brought in staff people who are much more excited about the aspect, who helped us be much more attentive to people who wanted to visit us and taste our wines. And now it's 15% of our business.
15%.
And for a quite large winery at this point by Oregon standards. But 15% of it is going direct to consumers.
And I asked a similar kind of a question, and I'm looking for nuances here. It's like, what do you think the vineyard, has taught you personally, about life, or
Well, I guess, in a sense, the vineyard hasn't taught me anything, but I've had to learn a lot about the vineyard and about vineyards generally. And I'll get there. But and I guess I say it that way, that the vineyard hasn't taught me anything. It may reflect my obliviousness to it. I've obviously heard people say that they learn from their vineyard. But the vineyard doesn't talk to me, and it doesn't teach me per se, but it forces me to learn. And I tend to learn from people. From time to time, we've done research, if you will. At one point, we were trying to understand, when I wrote a section of the Oregon Grape Growers Guide on trellising, I felt we needed to know about all the various different trellis options that we could be considering. And so we re-trellis sections of our vineyard to try to understand how they would work. And we learned by doing that research that there's some trellis systems that are really stupid in Oregon. We're planting one of our next vineyards with vine spacings of 3, 4, and 5 feet between the vines to try to understand what the difference is in the amount of space between the vine given a standard row width. And these are just small little experiments. There's just virtually unlimited numbers of things that one could be doing to understand more about the vineyard. We've certainly learned a lot about the vineyard from making wine from various vineyards. When we only made wine from one vineyard, we kind of were lazy grape growers because the vineyard didn't demand much from us, and we could make pretty good wine by being pretty lazy in the vineyard. Not stupid, not really lazy, but not having to do excessive amounts of work. Once we moved to a different site, which had to be farmed entirely differently because it was much more drought stressed and warmer and just a totally different type of entity, we realized that farming depended on the site and that different sites responded to the same type of farming differently. But this was us having to conceive of what was going on and taking a long time. I mean, I finally started to get a handle on this site when I went to Germany and stood next to a 12-year-old boy whose family made wine in Baden, and he tasted my Pinot Gris and said, "Oh, untypical aging." Had no idea what he was talking about. But that started a 2-year investigation that led us to understand what drought stress does, particularly to white wines, particularly in its most extreme versions, and helped us understand how to farm the site, ultimately, to make not only dense red wine, but incredibly rich white wine that was still very refreshing, which would not have been said about our Pinot Gris back when I stood next to that guy in Baden.
What's untypical aging?
It's an extreme response, probably from yeasts, but maybe the vine, to drought stress. So if a white vine is very heavily stressed, lacking water, it basically doesn't develop the flavor precursors that result in the intense flavors that we expect from wine. And even those flavors then quickly diminish in the first 9 months, so that the wine is basically kind of neutral and kind of weirdly acacia bloom-like. And it's a big problem in Germany, and it's a big problem in northern Italy. And in 1991, it was a big problem in Oregon. It was not often a big problem here, but on this side it could have been had we not realized what was going on and changed our farming.
So it's kind of like a splash of water, kind of a wake-up call.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was just, I mean, what we do in the vineyard today is totally different than what we would have done in a vineyard in 1971 or 2 when we first planted, 1972.
In what way?
Every single thing is different. What's the same? I don't know one thing that we do today that we would have done back then. It's not only attention to detail in sort of a general sense, but it's attention at every step of the year, making small changes to adapt to what Mom Nature is throwing at you that year. But if in the vineyard there are sort of 3 different big groups of decisions, the first set of determinants are what Mother Nature gives you overall, the site. Its elevation, its soil, its aspect, its steepness, all those things. And today, when we bought land, we were probably looking for Jory, red basaltic soils. We've certainly are perfectly happy to have sedimentary soils now, and have even more of those than we do basaltic soils. And we're even starting to plant a little bit in some of the soils that are influenced by the Missoula floods. Lower elevation rather than what once upon a time we would have thought maybe a little higher was good. Anyway, so that whole area, the site selection criteria have slowly changed. Not that the early sites wouldn't still be good, but we've expanded what we believe is possible.
Now, is that because of availability, or is that because of thought process? What's
Both. I mean, obviously, the David Lett's first site is not available any longer. On the other hand, I mean, you just drive over the line from Yamhill to Washington County, for instance, there instantly becomes huge quantities of hillside land available that nobody's thought to plant grapes because there's nobody next door that's already shown them that they could do it. But it's also because we've figured out that you can ripen, let's say, Pinot Noir on sites that are different than what we thought was the ideal site at the beginning. There appears to be plenty of bedding on north slopes and stuff that we would have avoided at all costs at the beginning. But beyond site, then there are all the long-term human decisions that are made. Vine spacing, clones, varieties even, row spacing, trellis systems, all that kind of thing. And that all, particularly clonal selection, planting distances, that all has an effect on wine quality. And when we were planting at the beginning, tractors were wide, nobody had any money for dense plantings, there was no rootstock available, it was available, but we had no idea why you'd use it. So that's totally changed. Everything is much, much tighter. There's probably four to six times as many vines per acre today than there were when we started planting. And everything's on rootstocks, of course, and not just because of phylloxera, but because of what it does with the ripening of grapes. And then the third area are the annual decisions that you make each year as the grapes are growing. And we've moved from having little idea how to deal with the variety of diseases and pests to having huge numbers of ideas and a lot of ideologies to follow. And everybody is picking their own way to solve those problems. Hopefully most of them are finding ways that work.
When I was here last time, you were showing me some charts, and then you also had some images of some landslide kind of images and images of soil types and things like that. And I wish I could have photographed those or something, because like I was reading your...
Oh, that was the stuff from... I can send that whole file over to you. So